Hello, so this is my run through the blood lab, and this might be used in the future as a pre-lab, but right now it's being used because we can't meet face-to-face due to COVID. Again, I have these boxes because these are my personal notes, and I can move them to the side when I need to, or you can get this document too. You will have a link to this document, or I'll put it in the More Info tab. I really like blood because all of us are going to have blood work. All of us might need to understand that, and not to knock any physician, but sometimes you want to be able to figure out this stuff yourself so you can be proactive and not necessarily rely on somebody else. So for example, I'm going to drag in here my CBC. It's quite old. It's like 8 years old at this point. But I didn't really get any input. My doctor was kind enough to send me this in the mail, and I had to basically figure out on my own what these numbers meant, and these numbers meant that I had B12 deficiency. And so I knew I needed to increase my B12 vitamins. So there's two actual things here. There's something called a complete blood count, and that goes through things like hemoglobin, hematocrit, red blood cells, and then some things down here that I'll go through in a second. Then you also have something called a white blood cell differential. And the white blood cell differential basically goes through and counts your types of white blood cells. So I like this figure, but I decided to turn it into an infographic. It's going to show up because this is normally a printed lab. It's going to show up horizontal. So I'm just going to come back here and look at this figure that I made. So basically I took those two components and I wanted to explain the different things in the white blood cell differential and then also in the complete blood counts. Now, in class, if we were meeting face-to-face, you'd be required to identify all of these white blood cells under the microscope except for maybe band neutrophils. You definitely would need to identify segmented neutrophils, and I always remember those. I mispronounce them as neutrophils, as in tri as in 3, because they usually have 3 to 4 nuclei, or lobes in their nuclei. Neutrophils commonly fight bacteria, so an elevation down here in neutrophils would indicate you have a bacterial infection. Of course, you might just want total white blood cells per milliliter because that would be an indication of you're losing white blood cells due to infection, or you're increasing white blood cells by a lot because, well, you could be increasing them by a little because of an infection or increasing them by a lot because of leukemia. Eosinophils, some people think they look like aliens because they have these two big nuclei. And the cytosol has these pink, or I think they look kind of orange granules. Eosinophils are for fighting parasites and also just inflammation and allergies in general. Lymphocytes make up natural killer cells, and then all of the cells in the third line of defense, so like TS, TC, TB, B lymphocyte cells, are all lymphocytes. And since most bacteria is killed by the first or second line of defense in the immune system, anything that makes it through those is going to be basically a virus. And so lymphocytes generally indicate a viral infection. Monocytes are really huge, and I'll show that in a second. That's chronic inflammation or chronic immune responses. Basophils to me kind of look like cotton candy. I know that's a stretch, but those are involved in inflammation. And then band neutrophils is an immature neutrophil, and the reason to pay attention to band neutrophils is if you have a lot of immature neutrophils out in your blood, that's an indication of cancer. You shouldn't have immature cells out in your blood. They should still be back in the bone marrow. Okay, so that's white blood cell differential. Now, I wanted to create a whole figure here, and so I wanted to include everything and then try and help you to basically decipher. You're not really being held to this in AP2 because it's pretty complex. The ones you're definitely held to are hematocrit and hemoglobin. I think you should know those two. So hematocrit is when we take blood and we spin it down, we get 3 different layers. We get red blood cells, a very thin layer of white blood cells, and then plasma. So hematocrit is the percent of your total blood that is red blood cells. And it should be between 41 and 50 for males and 36 to 44, maybe a little bit less because of menstruation in females. Hemoglobin is the amount of hemoglobin in those red blood cells. And that's a pretty simple test. You just judge the color of the red blood cells. The redder they are, the more hemoglobin they have. The paler they are, like in over here, then the more likely they are to have less hemoglobin. Now, I'm going to explain these briefly, but again, you're not really held to it. I just think it's cool. So red blood cell distribution with means do you have different sizes of red blood cells, some small, some large. That's usually an indication of cancer or not enough vitamins, because B vitamins are really important for making red blood cells and making hemoglobin. Mean corpuscular volume basically comes down to what's the size of the red blood cells. So B12 is necessary for methionine and for red blood cells to split. And if they don't have B12 when they're undergoing mitosis, then they might start to split, but they can't finish it, so they pop into big cells. So this is also called macrocytic anemia, because you have macro means big, cell anemia, so you can have big cell anemia. You can also have microcytic anemia, and that's usually things like iron deficiency because you don't have enough hemoglobin to fill up the cell. Kind of like that is just the color. Mean corpuscular hemoglobin is how much hemoglobin is in a red blood cell. So it can be too high, and that can usually indicate B12 deficiencies, or it can be low, and that can indicate things like iron deficiency anemias. So when it's too high, it's because you don't have enough red blood cells, and so your cells start making more hemoglobin, and so the red blood cells are full of more hemoglobin. And they look pale here because there's not enough hemoglobin in the cells. And then somewhere in between there, MCV and MCH are turned into a percentage, and that's MCHC. And again, that can be used to diagnose different types of anemias. You can also get a platelet count that can tell you things like your spleen is failing, or that you have alcoholism and that's killing off your platelets and things like that. And then RBCs per milliliter can tell you things like polycythemia. It's kind of like hematocrit, but it can be like you've got too many red blood cells or too few red blood cells. So again, when I come back over here, I was anemic. I also had low hemoglobin. I had a low hematocrit. And because, I guess it's still showing right here, because my red blood cells were really red, my red blood cells were trying to make it through not having enough blood cells by making more hemoglobin per red blood cell. And so that was B12 deficiency was my diagnosis. And B12 deficiency is pretty important to diagnose because while it starts with, the fatigue of pernicious anemia, it can lead to nerve damage too. All right, so I would like to ask questions about hematocrit, hemoglobin, and then everything on here except for band neutrophils is fair game for the practical. Let me go back to the lab. What we do next is we would identify the white blood cells. And so if we were face to face, we would look at these individual cells. We'd look at red blood cells. The important thing to see with red blood cells is I want to be able to compare them to white blood cells in size and color. And so this is a neutrophil again. So neutrophil, multiple lobe nuclei, and again they fight bacteria. And notice they're about the size of 2 red blood cells. Eosinophil, so this is our actual slide, 2 big nuclei. You see those little spots or granules. Eosinophils fight parasites and are involved in inflammation and allergies. Basophil is pretty hard to find. Lymphocyte is really small. It's the size of a red blood cell, maybe a little bit bigger, and that fights viruses. And then monocytes are huge. They're the size of 6 or 7 red blood cells. And again, that's chronic inflammation, chronic infections, things like that. I like this one too. You're never asked to tell me how many different white blood cells you have, but it's kind of interesting to know. Neutrophils, you have a lot of them. 1 in every 1,300 red blood cells is a neutrophil. A lot of band neutrophils. Eosinophils are pretty hard to find. Lymphocytes are really easy to find. So you have a lot of neutrophils. You have a lot of lymphocytes. You then have eosinophils, which are about the same as monocytes, and then basophils are pretty rare. Since we're not meeting face-to-face, we won't be able to do hematocrit and hemoglobin concentration. I would like you to go and watch this video right here. I guess it's going to be kind of hard, but I guess what you just do is search my channel for blood typing. That's what that is. And I guess since this is a video, it's hard to get this, but this is the blood typing infographic that you have access to. So you could, for some reason I have this under my blood lecture. I'll find it. So you have access to this on Talon. This sheet here, it's coming over. I'd like you to understand this. Honestly, from our point of view, we want to know the first 4 columns and go and watch that video. I think it's good to know this. Who can you receive blood from based on your blood type? Who can you donate blood to? And then whoever you can receive blood from is who you can donate plasma to. And whoever you can donate blood to is who you can receive plasma from. So go watch that video, blood typing. And then take a look at these 2 slides. So this is sickle cell. Sickle cell, generally, it takes out about 10% of the cells, but the patients or people that have sickle cell, they have a lot of fatigue. And there's two reasons. You're killing off your red blood cells. You're killing off the ones that sickled. So the spleen has really narrow capillaries. And when these sickle cell, I guess not narrow, but strong, they're not elastic. They don't stretch for the cell. Whereas other capillaries will stretch for red blood cells to get through. In the case of the spleen, these sickled cells will go through the spleen and they'll get ruptured. So you might have some anemia just because you don't have as many red blood cells. But also these can block capillaries, which means it causes a problem with internal respiration in the respiratory system. I guess I'd also like you to see iron deficiency. They look kind of haloed or ghost-like. So you'll still make the red blood cells, but you won't have the iron to put in the middle of the heme, which makes up hemoglobin. And so your cells will look really hollow, cause incredible fatigue. Normally in a face-to-face class, I'd have you go to this webpage and just kind of, not spend a lot of time, but look at these different case studies just to see that there's a lot of different ways that blood can fail you. Not only leukemias and like as in mononucleosis and things like that. Since we're not meeting face-to-face, those won't be required. So what do you need to know? I think you should, as I said, you should know what was in these charts. So know everything but band neutrophils. On this one, know hematocrit and hemoglobin. You should be able to identify your white blood cells. You should be able to do a blood typing. So if I took one of these figures, one of these, and cut it out and put it on the practical, you should be able to say, and then you have to watch the video first, this one's clumping, it's not clumping, it's not clumping. Since it clumped here, it's A negative blood, so you should be able to say this is A negative blood. So that's also fair in the practical. All right, that's it for blood. Thank you.